The river did not look like a killing ground. On the morning of April 9th, 1288, the Bạch Đằng River wore the face of peace. A thin white mist clung to the surface of the water, drifting between the mangrove roots like the breath of something ancient and sleeping. The sky above Quang Ninh was the colour of pewter, not yet gold, that fragile hour between darkness and dawn when the world holds its breath and waits. Herons stood motionless in the shallows. The tide was rising, slow and inevitable, the way all catastrophes begin. Quietly, with perfect patience, with no announcement at all. Then they came. From the south, the Yuan fleet materialized from the mist like a nightmare taking shape. 500 warships. 500. The largest armada ever assembled in the history of Southeast Asia. Each vessel a massive Chinese-built war junk, bristling with crossbowmen and armoured infantry, their banners bearing the nine-tailed insignia of Kublai Khan's empire. The empire that had already swallowed China whole, that had broken the Song dynasty, that had made kings weep and generals beg on their knees across 2 continents. They moved up the river like a jewelled serpent of iron and timber and silk, its scales catching the first grey light of morning, its body stretching so far back into the mist that no man standing on the bank could see where it ended. On the northern shore, hidden behind the limestone ridges, Chen Hongdao watched them come. He did not move. He did not speak. He had been waiting for this exact morning for months, perhaps for his entire life, and the waiting was nearly over. Around him crouched 10,000 soldiers who had tattooed the words Sat Tat, kill the Mongols, directly onto their skin, who had burned their own capital rather than surrender it, who had eaten less so the enemy would starve, who had hammered iron-tipped stakes into the riverbed in darkness and silence, stake by stake, night after night, until the river itself had become a weapon. The Mongols had never lost a naval battle, not one, not ever. They were about to lose everything. What happened on the Bạch Đằng River on this cold April morning in 1288 was not simply a military victory. It was not simply the defeat of one fleet by another, or one nation surviving the assault of another. It was the moment an entire empire, the most powerful military force the medieval world had ever produced, was stopped not by greater numbers, not by superior weapons, not by the intervention of gods or fate, but by one man's understanding of something no Mongol general had ever thought to study. The movement of water, the rhythm of tides, the patience required to let an enemy destroy itself. This battle ended Kublai Khan's dream of Southeast Asian conquest forever. It saved what would become Vietnam, and it was decided, ultimately, by pieces of wood buried in mud. To understand what was at stake on the Bạch Đằng River, you must first understand what the Mongol Empire actually was in 1288. Not as a historical abstraction, not as something you read about in textbooks between other historical abstractions, but as a living, breathing, world-ending reality that the people of Dai Viet woke up to every single morning of their lives. The Mongols, by 1288, had conquered more territory in less time than any civilization in human history. They had burned Baghdad, the greatest city in the Islamic world, and killed its caliph by wrapping him in carpets and trampling him under horses, so that royal blood would not touch the ground. They had shattered the Jin dynasty of northern China, absorbed it, then turned south and spent decades methodically dismantling the Song dynasty, the most sophisticated civilization on earth, piece by piece, province by province, until there was nothing left. They had pushed into Poland, into Hungary, into the edges of Europe, and only turned back because their great Khan had died and the generals needed to return for the succession. Europe did not defeat them. Europe simply got lucky with timing. Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, was by 1287 the ruler of the largest contiguous land empire ever assembled in human history. He sat in his palace in Khanbalik, the city the world would later call Beijing, and looked south, toward the dense, wet, fever-ridden jungles of Dai Viet, with the focused attention of a man who was not accustomed to being told no. Dai Viet had told him no 3 times. The first refusal came in 1258, when a Mongol force swept into the Red River Valley and captured the Vietnamese capital of Thang Long, what the world now calls Hanoi, only to find the city empty. The Vietnamese had taken their people, their food, their livestock, and disappeared into the forests and river deltas. Without food, without a fixed enemy to destroy, the Mongol force withered in the tropical heat and disease and retreated north. It was not a defeat, exactly, but it was not a victory either, and the Mongols were not people who accepted anything less than total victory. The second invasion came in 1284, and it was vastly larger. Prince Tohan, one of Kublai's sons, led somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 troops. The sources argue the numbers, but every account agrees on the word overwhelming, across the northern border of Dai Viet. They drove the Vietnamese king to the sea. They captured Thang Long again finding it empty, again finding no grain, no treasure, no enemy willing to stand and be destroyed in the open field. What they found instead was the jungle and the heat and the disease, and a Vietnamese force that hit them from every direction and from no direction, that appeared and vanished like smoke, that cut their supply lines and poisoned their wells, and gave them no moment of rest. By mid-1285, Toan's massive army was starving, sick, and desperate to go home. Chan Hung Dao hit them hardest during the retreat, inflicting devastating losses on a force that had arrived invincible and was leaving in ruin. The Mongol commander, Sogetu, was killed. Toan fled back to China with a fraction of the force he had brought south. Kublai Khan was furious. He prepared for a third attempt immediately. By 1287, the invasion force that crossed into Dai Viet was built around a different strategic concept. The land army would advance from the north, yes, but the decisive blow would be a massive naval force. 500 warships sailing up the coastal waterways and river systems, bypassing the jungles and swamps that had tortured the land forces so effectively, delivering directly into the heartland of Vietnam both the striking power and the supply chain that previous invasions had lacked. Leading this fleet was Omar, the most celebrated naval commander in Kublai's empire, the man who had commanded the leading squadrons in the destruction of the Song fleet, whose name was known from Yunnan to the South China Sea as synonymous with maritime dominance. This time, the Mongols told themselves there would be no escape. Chan Hung Dao heard about the approaching fleet and did not panic. He had been appointed supreme commander of Dai Viet's forces years before, and in the intervening time he had done something that no Mongol strategist apparently considered. He had read history. Specifically, he had studied what happened on this same river, the Bạch Đằng, in 938, when a Vietnamese general named Mo Quen had defeated a Chinese fleet in almost exactly this same manner, in almost exactly this same location, using almost exactly this same weapon. The stakes, the tides, the patience. Chen Hongdao stood over his maps and understood that the geography of the Bạch Đằng River had not changed in 350 years, and the physics of water had not changed either. And the arrogance of invaders had certainly not changed. And therefore the same trap could be sprung again. He simply needed to be patient enough to spring it. The Vietnamese king, Trần Nhân Tông, was 25 years old in 1287, and before the third invasion began, he pulled his supreme commander aside and asked a question that every Vietnamese schoolchild has heard repeated in the centuries since. He asked Hongdao, "Should we surrender?" The Mongol force assembling on the northern border was, by any rational military calculation, unstoppable. The king had seen his capital taken twice. He had seen his army driven to the sea. He understood what surrender might cost in terms of pride and sovereignty, but he also understood what continued resistance might cost in terms of blood and lives and the simple survival of his people. Chen Hongdao looked at his king and said, "Your Majesty, if you want to surrender, cut off my head first." That was not a metaphor. It was a statement of absolute commitment from a commander who had already decided, long before the armies moved, exactly how this story would end. But commitment alone does not win battles. What Hongdao possessed, beyond courage and beyond loyalty, was something rarer and more dangerous than either. He possessed a plan that required months of preparation, perfect timing, total secrecy, the cooperation of thousands of ordinary people who would never be remembered by name, and the willingness to allow the enemy to advance, to let them come deep into Vietnamese territory, to let them believe they were winning, while the real trap was assembled in the darkness beneath the surface of a river. Omar, sailing south with his 500 ships, had no idea that the river he was entering had already been redesigned. He was not sailing into Vietnam. He was sailing into a grave. The Bạch Đằng River is not a simple waterway. A Western commander looking at it for the first time would see a river, broad and tidal, opening toward the sea near what is today the province of Quang Ninh. He might notice the mangrove forests lining both banks, the tangle of roots descending into murky water, the countless small tributaries and channels branching off the main body in every direction, like cracks spreading from a stone thrown into glass. He might note that the main channel is navigable by large vessels, but only barely, and only when the tide is cooperative. He might observe that the limestone ridges rising on both sides of the river would make excellent positions for archers, that the narrow channel would restrict maneuverability for a large fleet, that the whole area felt enclosed and watchful, in the way that certain landscapes do when they have a history. What a Western commander would not see, because he would not know to look for it, was the tide. The tidal range on the Bạch Đằng is extraordinary. At its highest, the river swells over 3 meters above its low water mark, flooding the riverbanks, submerging the mudflats and sandbars, transforming the shallow northern tributaries into navigable channels. At its lowest, those same tributaries become mudfields, the sandbars emerge as islands, and the river bottom, normally hidden under meters of brown water, becomes terrain. This transformation happens twice a day, every day, with the regularity of a heartbeat. And the Vietnamese people who had lived along this river for generations understood it the way they understood breathing. It was simply part of the world. Chen Hongdao understood it as a weapon. His plan had 3 phases, and the genius of it was that each phase fed the next, each piece of preparation making the following piece more effective, The whole design interlocking with the precision of a mechanism built by someone who had spent months thinking about nothing else. Phase 1 was already complete by the time the Third Mongol invasion began. The systematic destruction of every food source the invading army might exploit. Crops were burned, livestock were driven away, granaries were emptied, and the grain hidden in the forests and river islands. When Togun's land force swept across the northern border in late 1287 and reached Tanglong, they found the capital abandoned for the third time, stripped bare, silent as a skull. There was nothing to eat. The army that had crossed the border, fat with confidence, began immediately to thin. But Phase 1 alone could not win the war. Kublai Khan had anticipated the scorched earth response this time. He had built his entire strategy around the naval supply chain. The 500 ships under Omar would deliver everything the land army needed: food, weapons, reinforcements. The logistical backbone without which no army in the medieval world could sustain a campaign. As long as Omar's fleet reached the Vietnamese interior intact, the land army could survive the empty granaries. The fleet was the key. Break the fleet, and the land army starved. Break the supply chain, and the entire invasion collapsed. This was Phase 2, and it fell to a Vietnamese general named Tran Can Du, a commander with a reputation as colourful as it was effective, who positioned his forces at the island of Van Don, in the coastal waters through which any supply fleet sailing south from China would have to pass. When Zhang Wenhu's enormous convoy of transport vessels appeared in late January 1288, Tran Can Du was waiting. The attack was devastating. Ships were sunk, supplies were scattered, and Zhang Wenhu turned his surviving vessels around and fled north toward Hainan Island. When Tran Yen Tong received the news, he said simply, "What the Yuan forces need most of all is food." They may not have heard of the defeat of their transport fleet. They may be planning further offensive action. He was right on all counts. But without food, further offensive action was not a strategy. It was desperation. And desperate men make the mistakes that patient men have prepared for. Phase 3 began in the last weeks of February 1288, under conditions of absolute secrecy, in the hours between midnight and dawn, in the cold, muddy darkness of the Bạch Đằng River's northern tributaries. The workers were soldiers, but they were also farmers, fishermen, men and women from the villages along the river who knew its rhythms the way they knew their own heartbeats. They worked in small groups, spread across the 3 northern distributaries, the Chan River, the Cane River, and the Rut River, communicating in whispers, moving in the dark, guided by the faint phosphorescent shimmer of the water, and their own extraordinary familiarity with this ground. Each group carried the same materials: logs of ironwood, the hardest timber in Vietnamese forests, almost impossible to cut with an axe, virtually impervious to the rot that would destroy softer wood in months. The logs had been cut and shaped in advance, each one beveled to a sharp point at one end, each point capped with a fitted iron head that had been forged by smiths working in secret for weeks. They ranged from 2 to 3 meters long. Some were as thick as a man's thigh. The technique was precise. At low tide, when the riverbed was accessible, workers would drive the stakes vertically into the mud, packing them deep, 2.5 meters below the surface in many cases, securing them with wooden bracing and, in some cases, ropes threaded through holes bored through the upper sections, creating a lattice that would resist being knocked aside by a ship's hull. Some stakes were driven straight. Others were angled 15 to 20 degrees, tilted toward the expected direction of approaching vessels, designed to catch a hull at the worst possible angle and punch through it rather than deflect off. The spacing between stakes was carefully calculated, close enough to create an impassable barrier, wide enough that the Vietnamese light craft, which drew far less water than the Yuan warships, could navigate between them if the pilots knew exactly where to go. And they did know. Every Vietnamese helmsman had memorized the positions. When the tide rose and covered the work, the river looked exactly as it always had. Brown, wide, quiet. The stakes disappeared under 2, 3, 4 meters of water, invisible to anyone who did not know they were there, untouchable by any probe or sounding line that a Yuan sailor might deploy as his vessel moved upstream. The surface of the river was a lie so perfect that it asked nothing of the liar except patience. But the night before the battle was not a time for patience. It was a time for something more elemental. In the camps behind the limestone ridges, in the reed shelters along the northern bank, among the men who would crew the decoy boats and the fire ships and the ambush squadrons, the hours between midnight and dawn moved slowly. A young soldier, his name is not recorded anywhere, lost like the names of 10,000 others who made this victory possible, sat at the edge of the water and turned a small carved wooden figure over in his hands. His mother had given it to him the morning he left his village. The wood was smooth from handling. He had touched it so many times in the months of waiting that his thumb had worn a groove into its surface. Around him, men sharpened blades they had already sharpened a dozen times, the rhythmic scrape of stone on metal, a kind of prayer. Some men spoke quietly, others were silent. The smell of incense drifted from a small shrine that someone had assembled from stones and a piece of silk, an offering to the river itself and to whatever spirits watched over the men who depended on it. The taste of fear was in every mouth, not the cowardly fear that makes a man run, but the cold, particular fear of a man who knows exactly what is coming and has decided to stand anyway. On the sleeves of their tunics, some men had inked those two words, or had them tattooed into their skin in the weeks before. Sat Tat. Kill the Mongols. 3 syllables that carried everything. 3 centuries of Chinese domination finally thrown off. 2 Mongol invasions barely survived. The terror of a third, and underneath all of it, the simple, immovable conviction that this land was theirs and would remain so. Chun Hungdao moved among his men in the darkness. He said very little. He had already said what needed saying months ago in the documents he had circulated to his officers. Practical military instructions, yes, but also something else, something closer to a letter from a father to his children, asking them to understand why this fight mattered, and why surrender was not merely defeat, but extinction. He had written of the shame of submission, of the debt owed to ancestors, of the world that would exist after the battle versus the world that would exist if the battle were lost. His men had read those words. They had made their decision. Tonight, there was nothing left to decide. In the river below, hidden under rising water, the stakes waited. Chun Hungdao looked at the sky. The tide would peak before dawn. By the time the sun rose high enough to burn the mist away, the Yuan fleet would be in position. And then the tide would begin to turn. Everything he had built, everything his soldiers had sacrificed, everything the nameless workers had driven into the riverbed, one stake at a time in the darkness, would depend on a single fact of hydrology that no Yuan admiral had thought to check. The Bạch Đằng River at low tide was a completely different river than the Bạch Đằng River at high tide, and Omar was sailing in at high tide. The mist had not lifted when the first Yuan warships appeared at the river mouth. They came in column, the great war junks leading, their high, curved prows cutting through the brown water with the absolute confidence of vessels that had never been stopped. The sound preceded them, the deep, rhythmic beat of war drums, the creak of massive timber hulls, the splash of hundreds of oars working in unison. A sound so vast and layered, it seemed less like noise and more like weather. The men on the Vietnamese riverbanks, who had spent the night in prayer and silence, heard it first as a vibration in the ground beneath them, a low subsonic pulse before it resolved into sound. Some of them had never seen an ocean-going war junk up close. Now they saw 500 of them. The Yuan warships were built for war on the open water, massive and imposing, their decks crowded with armoured soldiers and crossbowmen, their hulls reinforced with iron fittings, their superstructures rising high above the waterline to provide elevated firing positions for archers and artillery crews. Banners in yellow and red snapped in the morning river breeze. The insignia of Kublai Khan's dynasty, the dragon of the Yuan house, repeated itself across the fleet in a statement of power so deliberate it bordered on prayer. We are the Mongols. We have never been stopped. We will not be stopped today. Omar stood at the prow of his flagship and watched the river unfold ahead of him. He was a man who had spent his career reading water. Reading it the way others read faces, instinctively, constantly, cataloguing depth and current and obstacle with the unconscious fluency of long expertise. He had commanded fleets in the South China Sea and on the great Yangtze River. He had shattered the Song naval forces in engagements that lasted days and left wreckage floating for miles. He understood ships and water and the psychology of men under fire at sea. What he did not understand, what no one in his fleet understood, because no one had thought to ask the question, was where the tidal datum was this particular morning on this particular river. The tide was high. The Bạch Đằng, swollen with the morning flood, lay wide and deep and generous beneath his fleet. The channel was navigable. The water depth was sufficient. There was nothing visible on the surface of the river to cause concern. Nothing at all. He ordered the advance to continue. 2 miles ahead, hidden behind the rocky outcropping of Gen Kok and the tree-covered banks of the Dong Kok and Phong Kok channels, Dai Viet's light flotilla sat motionless in water so still it might have been glass. The pilots knew exactly where they were. They knew exactly where the stakes were. They knew exactly what the tide was doing, because they had grown up on this river, because they had learned to read the Bạch Đằng the way other men learned to read faces. They were waiting for a signal that would not come until the Yuan fleet had committed itself fully to the channel, until the geometry of the river had made retreat as difficult as advance. Chen Hongdao watched from the ridge above and said nothing. The tide was still rising. He could wait. 2 hours after dawn, with the Yuan fleet deep in the Bạch Đằng channel and the morning mist beginning to burn away in the pale spring sunlight, the Vietnamese decoy boats appeared. They came fast, low in the water, a ragged line of small craft, crewed by men who rowed with the desperate energy of people fleeing for their lives. They swept around the downstream bend of the river into the full sight of the Yuan vanguard, and they were close. Close enough for the Yuan crossbowmen to see the fear on their faces, close enough to hear them shouting. Then the decoy boats wheeled in the water, turned upstream, and ran. Omar watched them go and felt the particular satisfaction of a hunter who has spotted movement in the grass. This was what he had expected. The Vietnamese would not fight a frontal engagement with 500 warships. Of course they would not. They would retreat, as they always retreated, drawing the Yuan fleet deeper into their territory, while their small, agile craft pecked at the margins. He had dealt with this before. He knew how to respond. He gave the order to pursue. The Yuan vanguard surged forward, oars churning, the massive hulls accelerating up the narrowing channel. The decoy boats fled ahead of them, maintaining just enough distance to stay out of crossbow range, leading the pursuers exactly where Tren Hung Dao needed them to go. Deeper into the channel, further from the open water, closer to the northern tributaries, where the stakes waited in their silence. The geometry of the pursuit was perfect. As the Yuan fleet compressed into the narrowing channel, ship after ship crowding behind the vanguard, the possibilities for maneuver reduced. There was forward. There was no longer any useful backward. On the ridges above, Dai Viet's land forces watched the fleet pass below them, 500 ships moving upstream like a city on water. Archers checked their arrows. Infantry gripped their weapons. No one moved. No one made a sound. By noon, the tide had been falling for more than 2 hours. This was the fact that would end the Yuan dynasty's dream of Southeast Asian conquest. The tide had been falling for more than 2 hours, and no one on the Yuan fleet had measured it. Perhaps they had been too focused on the pursuit. Perhaps they had assumed the channel depth they had measured at the river mouth would hold throughout their advance. Perhaps they had simply not imagined that a river could betray them, that the ground beneath their hulls could transform from water to weapon in the time it took to chase a handful of small boats. Whatever the reason, the Yuan fleet had committed itself fully to the channel, and the tide had been dropping for 2 hours, and the stakes beneath the surface of the water were now less than a metre below the keels of the largest warships, and still falling. Omar saw the Vietnamese decoy boats slow ahead of him, and felt the first whisper of unease. They were not running harder. They were waiting. That was wrong. Prey did not wait for a predator. Prey ran. Unless the prey was not prey, unless the prey was bait. He opened his mouth to give an order. Before the words could leave him, the river changed. The sound came first. Not a crash, not an explosion, something subtler and more terrible. A deep, grinding crack. The sound of a massive timber hull meeting something that did not yield. Follow immediately by another crack from a different direction, then a third, then sounds too numerous and too close together to count individually, overlapping into a continuous tearing percussion that ran up the river from ship to ship as the Bạch Đằng revealed what it had been holding. Silence. A single breath of absolute silence. Then chaos. The stakes rose from the water like the teeth of something that had been sleeping and was now finally awake. First one, then dozens, then hundreds, the iron-tipped ironwood poles breaking the surface in every direction as the receding tide stripped away the concealment that had hidden them through the entire morning. They had been there since February. They had waited through the flood tides and ebb tides of 6 weeks, patient in the mud, waiting for exactly this configuration of events. A large fleet, a narrow channel, a falling tide, and an enemy that had no idea any of it was possible. The leading Yuan warships had already struck. Their hulls, massive, reinforced, built to withstand the impact of smaller craft and the battering of ocean storms, had not been built to withstand iron-tipped stakes punching upward from below at angles specifically calculated to do maximum structural damage. The first ship listed immediately, water pouring through the wound in its hull. Soldiers on its deck scrambled for the railings. Then the second ship struck, and the third. And now the fleet behind them was driving forward under its own momentum, compressing, the following vessels ramming into those ahead, creating a catastrophic accordion of collisions that transformed the Yuan vanguard from an attacking fleet into a tangled, immobilized mass. The pilots of ships farther back tried to reverse. Their oars bit water. The current pushed against them. The channel was too narrow to turn. Ships that tried to wheel came broadside to the current and were pushed downstream, directly into the stake fields their own vanguard had just discovered. Men shouted in Chinese, in Mongolian, in the dozen other languages that a Yuan army carried. No one could hear anyone else. The drums that had beaten so confidently through the morning advance had stopped. Omar stood on his flagship and watched his fleet die, and understood, in the specific clarity that arrives in moments of utter catastrophe, that he had been led here deliberately. Every step of the morning, the mist that had hidden the river's condition, the convenient appearance of the decoy boats, the chase that had seemed so natural, so much like victory, right up until the moment it became this. The empty river ahead, the impossible forest of stakes surrounding him, the lowering water that continued to recede with total indifference to human catastrophe. None of it was accident. He had been beaten before the battle began. The stakes were not just physical barriers, they were the materialization of months of Vietnamese thought, Vietnamese sacrifice, Vietnamese refusal to be conquered. Each one had been driven into the mud by human hands working in darkness. Each one represented a choice made by a nameless soldier, a nameless fisherman, a nameless woman who had helped carry the ironwood logs to the riverbank, to resist rather than submit. Now those choices, multiplied by the thousands, were punching through the hulls of the most powerful fleet in Asia. And the river was doing the rest. The Bạch Đằng continued to fall. Where the water had been deep enough for a war junk 2 hours before, it was now too shallow to float one. Ships that had not struck stakes settled into the mud as the tide abandoned them, heeling to their sides, their hulls groaning under their own weight, their crews clinging to the tilting decks, or abandoning them entirely for the riverbanks. The banks were not safe. On the banks, something else had been waiting. The signal came from the ridge above the river. Not a trumpet, not a drum, but a single banner unfurled against the pale morning sky, visible for miles to anyone who had spent months watching for it. Chen Hungdao raised his hand. Then he lowered it. From behind Gen Kok, from the hidden channels of the Quai and Tai and Gia Duc and Din Kong rivers, the Vietnamese flotilla erupted into motion. Light boats, dozens of them, crewed by men who knew every inch of the channel, who knew exactly where the safe corridors between the stakes ran, who could navigate the Bạch Đằng River in darkness and fog, and could certainly navigate it now, when the channel was crowded with stricken Yuan warships and the water was lit by the reflections of rising flames. They carried fire. The fireships had been prepared in advance. Small craft packed with dried reeds, oil-soaked timber, combustible material, chosen and arranged by men who had thought carefully about how fire moves on water and in wind and across wooden hulls. They were lit as they moved. By the time they reached the stricken Yuan fleet, they were fully ablaze, unmanned, released into the current to drift among the trapped warships like burning angels, touching each hull they met and leaving it transformed. The first Yuan ship caught fully, then another. The fire moved faster than the water had, leaping from vessel to vessel through the dry timber and the canvas and the cordage that connected them. The yellow and red banners of Kublai's dynasty burning with particular ferocity, as if the fire found them especially satisfying. Men on burning decks made terrible choices: stay and burn, or leap into water that was now barely waist-deep in the shallows and hide nothing from the archers on the banks. Most chose the water. Most did not survive the choice. From above, on the limestone ridges, 10,000 Vietnamese soldiers descended. The roar that went up from the Vietnamese line was not a battle cry exactly. It was something older and more total. The sound of a people who had been driven to the sea, who had burned their own capital, who had eaten their country empty rather than feed an invader, who had spent months hammering stakes into a riverbed in the dark, now releasing everything that had been held in compression for 3 years of survival. King Tran Yen Tong himself appeared on the high ground above the river, visible to both armies, 25 years old and apparently unafraid. And the men below him, who saw their king standing openly on the ridge and not fleeing, not surrendering, found something extra in themselves that they had not known was there. Sat-tat. The words rose from 10,000 throats simultaneously. Kill the Mongols. By mid-afternoon, the southern shore of the Bạch Đằng was a continuous line of fire and fighting. Yuan soldiers who had made it to the bank found Vietnamese infantry waiting for them, and the infantry had the advantage of ground and anger, and 3 years of accumulated purpose behind every stroke. Those who had escaped the burning ships, only to be cut down on the mudflats, died in the mud, in water that was ankle-deep at best, far from the open sea that might have offered escape, far from China, far from the court of Kublai Khan. The Yuan fleet, which had entered the Bạch Đằng in the morning as the greatest naval force in Asia, was by afternoon an archipelago of burning and sunken hulls, some still being consumed by fire, others already settling into the mud of the riverbed, their masts tilted at angles that would have been unimaginable 12 hours before. The battle did not end cleanly. Nothing this large ends cleanly. There were pockets of Yuan resistance, groups of soldiers who found defensible ground and held it for hours. Others who fought their way to the riverbanks and vanished into the mangroves, attempting to find a way north to where Toan's land army was already beginning its own desperate retreat. But the strategic outcome was decided before the sun reached the center of the sky. The fleet was gone. The supply chain was severed. The invasion was over. The only question remaining was Omar. He had not run. That much can be said for Omar. When the battle collapsed around him, he did not immediately abandon his flagship for a smaller vessel and flee downstream. He stayed, and he commanded, and he attempted to salvage something from the wreckage of the morning, ordering ships that had not yet struck stakes to form a defensive line, calling on his infantry to hold the bank wherever they could reach it, doing the things a commander does when he refuses to accept that the battle is already over. But the river was not listening, and neither was the tide. His flagship had moved too deep into the channel during the pursuit. When the tide fell, there was no safe water to reverse into. He tried to maneuver. The ship's keel found mud. He tried again. Around him, the last operational Yuan vessels were being engaged by Vietnamese light craft, swarmed from every direction by boats whose pilots knew the channel and whose men had spent 3 years accumulating reasons to fight without mercy. The sound of the battle around him was continuous and all-encompassing. Burning timber, shouting men, the percussion of weapons, the hissing of water meeting fire. A sound so total it seemed to come from inside the skull rather than outside it. The flagship struck a stake, then another. The hull opened. Omar was taken on the surface of the river, in the shallows, in the muddy brown water of the Bạch Đằng at low tide. The most celebrated naval commander in Kublai Khan's empire, standing in water up to his waist, surrounded by Vietnamese soldiers in light craft, having no options remaining that were worth considering. He had been captured before he reached the bank. He would not be ransomed. He would not be released. He would not see China again. Word of Omar's capture spread through what remained of the Yuan fleet faster than the fire had. The last organized resistance collapsed. Soldiers who had been fighting with the particular stubbornness of men who still believed their commander might somehow reverse the situation simply stopped fighting when they understood he was gone. They threw down weapons. They raised hands. They waded to the banks and sat in the mud and waited for whatever came next. On the northern shore, where the land army under Toan had been watching the destruction of his naval support, the prince did not wait to see what came next. He turned his forces north and began the retreat to China. The same retreat his father's generals had made in 1285, leaving behind the bodies of his soldiers and the wreckage of the invasion, and the dream of a Yuan Southeast Asia burning on the surface of a river that had never wanted him there. The Bạch Đằng was quiet by evening. The mist had not returned. The sky above the river was red with smoke and with the late light of an April sun. And in the water, between the tilted hulls of burned and sinking warships, between the stakes that stood above the surface, now like a forest of iron-tipped monuments, the tide had stopped falling and was beginning, slowly, imperceptibly, to rise again. It always rose again. That was the nature of tides. That was the genius of the man who had understood them. The accounting of the dead at the Battle of Bạch Đằng in 1288 is, like most medieval accounting of the dead, imprecise. Vietnamese sources describe the Yuan fleet as essentially destroyed. The majority of 500 warships either sunk, burned, or captured in the engagement. Chinese sources, which tend toward understatement in the area of military defeats, acknowledge significant losses without offering specific totals. Modern historians, examining the archaeological evidence and the logistical record of what the Yuan dynasty attempted to do in Dai Viet after 1288, which was nothing, because there was nothing left with which to do it, tend toward the conclusion that the loss was catastrophic in absolute terms and total in strategic ones. A fleet that had sailed south in confidence and returned north as splinters and ash had not been merely defeated. It had been eliminated as a factor. Of the soldiers, the sailors, the oarsmen, the crossbowmen, the infantry who had shipped south on those 500 vessels, believing they were part of the most powerful force in Asia, the exact number who died in the Bạch Đằng River on April 9th, 1288, is not recoverable. They lie in the river still, in the mud beneath centuries of silt, unnamed in any record that has survived. Archaeology has found them in fragments, wood and iron, the occasional artifact that suggests human presence, the charcoal layers in the riverbed that mark where fire reached water and water eventually won. Omar lived past the battle, which perhaps surprised him. He was taken as a high-value prisoner, the Yuan dynasty's most celebrated naval commander, a figure of genuine strategic importance, and held in Vietnamese custody while the diplomatic aftermath of the battle was negotiated in the months that followed. The Vietnamese king, Tren Nhan Tong, proved willing to use Omar as a gesture of normalization, agreeing in 1289 to return the admiral to China as part of a prisoner exchange designed to stabilize relations with the Yuan court. The gesture was diplomatic. The execution was Chen Hongdao's. Without the king's knowledge, or at least without his recorded objection, the ship carrying Omar back to China was arranged to sink at sea. Whether this was murder or statecraft depends entirely on who is asked the question. What is not disputed is that Omar never reached China. The river that had refused to give him victory also refused to give him passage home. Togan reached China alive. Kublai Khan received the news of the third consecutive failure in Dai Viet, the failure that had cost him his greatest admiral, his largest fleet, and the last credible possibility of southern expansion, and banished his son to Yangzhou for the remainder of his life. The punishment was perhaps as much for the first two failures as for the third. But the third was the one that ended the argument. Toan spent the rest of his life in provincial obscurity. The armies never marched south again. The battlefield, in the days after the fighting, was a landscape that would have been difficult to look at directly. The river carried the evidence of what had happened everywhere the current touched. Burned timber, torn cloth, the wreckage of 500 ships slowly distributing itself across the delta. The villagers who returned to the banks found the stakes still standing, most of them undamaged by the battle, the ironwood having proved as durable in combat as in practice, jutting above the water at low tide like a forest that had grown overnight. The bodies of the Yuan dead floated among the hulks, and the Vietnamese who retrieved them were not, by all accounts, unkind in their treatment. The ordinary dead of any army are not their emperor's crimes. In the weeks that followed, the diplomatic framework of the conflict was renegotiated. Dai Viet acknowledged in formal terms the nominal supremacy of the Yuan dynasty, a face-saving arrangement that cost the Vietnamese nothing real while giving Kublai's court the language of tribute it required. In practice, the independence of Dai Viet was absolute and acknowledged by all parties who had any incentive to be honest about it. The Yuan dynasty would never again seriously pursue military conquest in Vietnam. The tributary relationship that followed was a performance, and everyone understood it as such. Kublai Khan died in 1294, having never retried. He had conquered more of the world than any ruler before him. He had failed, in the end, to add one small country in the southeast, a country that had beaten him with wood and water and patience, and a general who read history more carefully than he did. The stakes remained in the riverbed. Most of them, having served their purpose, were simply covered again by the returning tides, buried in the accumulating silt of the centuries, lost to the visible world, but not to the geological one. The river moved on, as rivers do. The mangroves grew back over the banks. Villages rebuilt themselves. The people who had emptied their granaries and burned their crops and hammered iron-tipped poles into the mud in the darkness of February nights returned to their fields and resumed the ordinary work of living, which is always the work that comes after war, always the work that wars are supposedly fought to protect. What lay beneath them in the mud of the Bạch Đằng would wait, patient as the original stakes, for 700 years. Kublai Khan's ambition died in stages, but the Bạch Đằng was where it was mortally wounded. He launched no fourth invasion of Dai Viet. The plans that may have existed on paper in the court at Canbalik were quietly abandoned, the resources redirected to other projects, more attainable ones, presumably, ones that did not require sailing warships into rivers that the locals had spent months turning into traps. The The dream of a Mongol Southeast Asia, which had seemed so achievable in 1287 when the fleet sailed south under the command of the greatest naval commander in Asia, simply stopped being dreamed. Dai Viet's survival created a precedent and a reality. The Mongol Empire could be beaten by people who were patient enough, creative enough, and committed enough to use their own geography against the invader. The nations that surrounded Dai Viet noticed. The inspiration that flowed outward from the Bạch Đằng victory was not abstract. It was the concrete demonstration visible to any kingdom in the region that was wondering whether resistance was possible, that the Mongols bled and burned and drowned like anyone else when the circumstances were made unfavorable enough. Dai Viet's survival was a lighthouse. It told the surrounding darkness that land could be defended. The military legacy of Trần Hùng Đạo did not end in 1288. It had barely begun. His approach to asymmetric warfare, the systematic use of terrain and logistics as primary weapons, the deliberate avoidance of pitched battles until the enemy had been sufficiently weakened, the transformation of apparent retreat into strategic preparation, became the foundational text of Vietnamese military thought for the centuries that followed. Every subsequent defense of Vietnamese territory against foreign invasion drew, consciously or not, from what he had established on the Bạch Đằng. French colonial officers discovered this in the 19th century. American military planners discovered it in the 20th. The lesson they all eventually learned, that a smaller force fighting on its own ground, with full knowledge of that ground and full commitment to its defense, possesses advantages that numbers and technology cannot automatically overcome, is the lesson that the stakes in the Bạch Đằng River were teaching as early as 1288. Some lessons take a very long time to be learned. The physical evidence of the battle returned to the world gradually. In 1953, during the construction of a river dike in the In Hung district of Quang Ninh province, workers discovered wooden stakes buried in the riverbank. They were dark brown, nearly black, astonishingly hard. Ironwood keeps its integrity in anaerobic mud for centuries, and they were arranged in a pattern that made no sense as a natural formation. Local historians recognized immediately what they were looking at. Excavations in the following decades uncovered hundreds of stakes still in their original positions, arranged in the zigzag pattern that Hùng Đạo engineers had designed, some still angled at the precise degrees recorded in historical accounts. The past had been physically present under the mud all along. In 2019, in a rice field in Lien Khe Commune, Tuy Nguyen district of Haiphong City, a farmer named Nguyen Tuan Trieu was tilling soil for vegetable planting and hit something hard beneath the surface. He dug carefully, then less carefully, with the growing urgency of someone who understands they have found something important. He had found the Chao Kui stake field, 27 ironwood poles, carbon dated to the period between 1270 and 1430, buried in what had once been the bed of a tidal channel connecting the Jia River to the Dabac River, a channel that, in April of 1288, had been exactly the route a retreating Yuan fleet might have taken, a channel that had been prepared for them. The discovery did not merely confirm what historians already knew, it expanded it. The Cao Kui find proved that the Battle of Bạch Đằng was not a single engagement at a single location, but a coordinated defensive campaign spread across an entire river system. Multiple stake fields, multiple ambush positions, multiple tributaries, prepared and monitored and activated in sequence. The genius of Trần Hùng Đạo had been even larger than the surviving documents suggested. 737 years after the battle, a farmer's plough found the evidence. The ironwood stakes were essentially intact. The mud of the Bạch Đằng had preserved them better than any archive. The river keeps its secrets carefully and releases them slowly and only when it chooses. Centuries later, the Bạch Đằng still flows to the sea through Quang Ninh, still subject to its twice-daily tidal transformation. Still the same narrow, mangrove-lined, deceptively ordinary-looking waterway that it was on the morning of April 9th, 1288. Tourists visit the stake-yards now. There are markers. There are museums. Children learn the name Drunhung Dao the way American children learn the name George Washington, as the figure who stands at the origin of national identity, who was present at the moment when the nation's existence was genuinely in question, and chose to defend it with everything available. Kublai Khan built his empire with an army of 600,000. Drunhung Dao defended his country with something that army could not conquer: the absolute knowledge of his own ground, the patience to wait for the right moment, and the understanding that rivers, when respected, when studied, when transformed by human intelligence into something the enemy has no framework to understand, are more powerful than any fleet ever built. The stakes are still there, in the mud, waiting. Some weapons never stop working.